Anyone who was there will tell you that Papua New Guinea was a tropical inferno, particularly along the northern coast. "If I owned New Guinea and I owned hell, I would live in hell and rent out New Guinea," asserted an American infantryman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who served in the U.S. 32nd Infantry Red Arrow Division. The terrain, climate, and disease devastated the regiments of the 32nd Division and the accompanying Australian battalions, in addition to the Japanese's suicidal and determined defense of the coastal region of Buna in northern Papua New Guinea. During the same period, Papua suffered 3 times as many casualties than Guadalcanal, adjusted for the strength of the attacking forces. Malaria plagued over 2/3 of the Allied forces assaulting the northern coast of Papua. Disease-related losses were 4 or 5 times higher than combat-related losses. Nowhere in the world today are American soldiers engaged in fighting so desperate, so merciless, so bitter, or so bloody. Time magazine wrote at the end of December 1942, introducing the American public to New Guinea. As for the Japanese, one of their infantrymen noted, "The path gets steadily steeper. We are in a jungle area." Not surprisingly, a GI fighting along the Buna front cried out, "God help us! We're never going to get out of here alive." Here, the sun is harsh. There are no roads in the bush we are traversing. The rainforest is indescribable. Water thirst, empty stomach. The backpack weighs a much. The men at the front were perhaps among the most wretched-looking soldiers ever to wear the American uniform, a Buna veteran said of his American comrades. Their sunken eyes had big dark rings under them, and they looked emaciated and haggard. Tropical sores were all over them. Of the thousands of soldiers that ventured into the bush, very few did not suffer from a fever at least once. Situated just north of the Australian continent, New Guinea is the second biggest island in the world, spanning 1,500 kilometers. Australia was in charge of Papua, which is located in the southeast of New Guinea and makes about 1/3 of the country's total area. It was seen by Australia's military strategists as a deterrent to Japanese invasion of the Northern Territories. To put it mildly, the interior is hostile. The region is covered in swamps and jungles, and the landscape is dominated by the high mountains of the Owen Stanley Range. Prior to the conflict, the majority of the 3,000 residents of the principal town, Port Moresby, on the south coast, were native Papuans. Buna and Gona are 2 of the few villages that dot the northern coast of Papua. In northeastern New Guinea, Lae and Salamaua are similarly located on the northern coast, close to the Huon Gulf. The entire region is a low-lying, level plain, but the Buna region is composed of fields of shoulder-high kunai grass, coconut plantations, and hot, impenetrable jungle. The Kokoda Trail was the most well-known of the native routes that connected the north and south coasts away from Port Moresby. In terms of troop movements, reinforcements, supplies, and the treatment of the injured, there would be significant climatic and topographical barriers to military operations on both sides. Japan, the United States, and Australia were unprepared for a big conflict in the South Pacific, which was not only far away but also rife with illness and always damp. In New Guinea, the fighters would have to be able to build makeshift roads and bridges where mud and water controlled movement. How did some of the bloodiest battles in the South Pacific take place on the Buna front? The Japanese High Command considered an Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, objective to expand southeastward into Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, Fiji, Tonga Islands, and Samoa, Operation FS, after its incredible run of lightning successes following Pearl Harbor. This was done in order to cut off the long supply lines from the U.S. to Australia and New Zealand, effectively preventing the Antipodes from becoming American bases and staging areas for a counteroffensive. The Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, intended to conquer the Lae Salamaua region in the Huon Gulf region of northeast New Guinea with the IJN's help. Only after Lae and Salamaua had been captured would Tulagi, close to Guadalcanal and the Solomons, be conquered and developed into a naval air base. The goal of capturing these key locations in eastern New Guinea and Tulagi in the southern Solomons, which the IJN managed to do in early May 1942, was to neutralize the waterways north of Australia and cut off communications between these regions and the Australian mainland. The Japanese kept the South Pacific supply lanes open to Australia, New Zealand, and New Caledonia by delaying Operation FS, the larger southeastern attack. This was a mistake they would eventually have to make. On March 8-11, 1942, the IJA and the IJN's Special Naval Landing Force, SNLF, landed in Salamaua, Lae, and Fischhofen on the Huon Gulf, marking the start of the Japanese staging operations to capture northeast New Guinea and Papua. By controlling those areas, the Japanese were able to operate out of Port Moresby and prevent the Allies from using airfields in northern Australia. They were also only 400 air miles from Cape York, Australia's northernmost point that faces Papua. By April 1942, Japanese naval movements and air capabilities in the Solomon Sea were severely damaged by Allied airstrikes. Since neither side had fully established air superiority over New Guinea, SNLF forces landed in Fafak, Babo, Sorong, Manokwari, Momi, Nabiri, Seroy, Sarmi, and Hollandia along the north coast of northeast New Guinea from April 1st, 20, in order to occupy and build airfields there. In order to control the sea lanes and facilitate future amphibious operations for expansion, it was becoming increasingly clear that the success of the Pacific War would be largely decided by either seizing enemy airfields or finding adjacent appropriate terrain to build new ones. The IJA and IJN planned to launch a combined amphibious assault on Port Moresby on the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula after successfully completing their operations in the Huon Gulf and coastal northeast New Guinea. However, this was ultimately foiled at the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 4th-8, 1942. At Milne Bay, on the eastern tip of Papua, where American and Australian engineers had coincidentally started building an airstrip, a second effort at the seaborne invasion of Port Moresby was planned for the late summer of 1942. The IJA planned to launch an overland attack from Buna via the Kokoda Trail and across the Owen Stanley Range to capture Port Moresby at the same time as the Japanese Milne Bay offensive. The Japanese believed that a road that was suitable for automobiles extended from Buna to Kokoda Village in the northern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range, but the jungle canopy prevented it from being clearly seen and photographed. In order to make such a road functional and construct more southward tracks to reach Port Moresby, the IJA planners made the logistical mistake of assuming that Formosan and Korean workers, in conjunction with IJA engineers, could do so. General Douglas MacArthur received a cable from President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Philippines on February 21, 1942, directing him to evacuate the vulnerable Corregidor to Mindanao before continuing on to Australia. In 4 PT boats, MacArthur and his staff officers' retinue departed Corregidor on March 11th and reached Mindanao. From there, they were airlifted to Australia. At the express request of the Australian government, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall nominated him Commander-in-Chief, Southwest Pacific Area, SWPPA Theater. General Sir Thomas Blamey was chosen by Australian Prime Minister John Curtin to lead the Allied land forces in the SWPA. Since his own AIF forces were either in the Mediterranean or in captivity, the latter following the surrender of Malaya and Singapore, Curtin was happy to receive the Green American 32nd and 51st Infantry Divisions, both National Guard battalions, being quickly dispatched to Australia's defense. The 32nd and 41st Divisions reached Australia in May and April of 1942, respectively. When MacArthur was given command of the SWPA by the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, he was given the mission to seize and occupy Rabaul and adjacent positions in the New Guinea, New Ireland area, as well as to recapture Lae and Salamaua without a deadline. Buna Government Station, with its small airfield, the Old Strip, was the logical location for MacArthur's staff to retake Lae and Salamaua. Buna had been an Australian outpost facing Rabaul on the Solomon Sea, and consisted of the Old Strip and a government station called Buna Mission, which had only 3 houses. A half-mile to the northwest, Buna Village was just a group of indigenous huts. an ancient Anglican mission was in Gona, 10 miles north of Buna. Both Japanese and Allied military strategists in the Southwest Pacific desired Buna as a potential base and airfield complex. Buna was inspected by MacArthur's engineers to determine whether it would be a suitable location for an airfield. The Allied engineers left after determining that the coastline terrain was suitable. MacArthur ordered the Australian commander in Port Moresby to safeguard the Buna area because it was probably a Japanese target as well. MacArthur's biggest concern was that the Japanese may take Port Moresby and use it as a base from which to invade northern Australia. Because the Buna region was the northern terminus of the one good track to Port Moresby, the Kokoda Trail, Australian military planners also viewed it as a serious danger. In order to capture Buna, the Australians formed a native constabulary force and a militia unit, the 39th Battalion, in June 1942. 8 days later, Company B of the Australian 39th Battalion was on the outskirts of Kokoda Village. On July 7th, company-strength elements of the Australian 39th Battalion were 30 miles north of Port Moresby, prepared to begin their ascent of the Kokoda Trail. The remaining members of the 39th Battalion were instructed to evacuate from Port Moresby to Kokoda Village as soon as practicable on July 24th. The town was located in the northern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range, in a valley 1,200 feet above sea level. Kokoda Village possessed a small airfield, which was also a primary goal in Japanese strategic planning, in addition to a rubber plantation and a Papuan administration station. MacArthur gave the order to set up his advance base at Buna on July 15th. Additionally, a grassy plain that would be big enough for both bombers and fighters was to be found at Dobodura, 15 miles south of Buna, where a new airstrip was to be built. The Buna strip had been deemed unsuitable for the airbase the SWPA commander had in mind by Allied reconnaissance planes. But at Buna and nearby Gona, the Japanese had outperformed the Allies. A preliminary force of 4,400 engineers from the Yokoyama Advance Force, commanded by Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama, and the South Seas Detachment IJA headquarters, which had taken Rabaul, were landed by Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and transports on July 21-22, 1942. Majia's Gentures Tomitaro Hori was in charge of both units. With the addition of the IJA's 41st Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Yazawa Kiyomi, and the remaining members of the 144th Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayaku Take, commander of the IJA 17th Army, with headquarters in Rabaul, would expand this advance force to 1,100 troops. The Bunagona area would be occupied by the IJA by August 13th and converted into a base of operations. Yokoyama wasted no time in directing his front units to march south to Kokoda Village shortly after the Japanese landed at Buna. On July 28th, this force, which was made up of the main fighting arm of the Army, 1st Battalion, 144th Infantry Regiment, and the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, which would clear roads and construct depots, attacked the Australians in an attempt to capture Kokoda Village and its valuable airstrip. This force's first assignment was to evaluate the quality and state of the roads and determine whether the Buna to Kokoda road needed to be repaired. Nevertheless, without a comprehensive feasibility study, the Emperor and Imperial Japanese headquarters, acting through IJA 17th Army headquarters, directed the Yokoyama force to prepare for an overland assault to capture Port Moresby, Operation MO, rather than carrying out a civil engineering reconnaissance. Regardless of the true condition of the existing road, a cynical General Horai doubted that a supply line of local porters, 32,000 was considered a necessary quantity, could be maintained. The Kokoda Trail was actually a 145-mile mud trail that was little wider than 3 or 4 feet. It went over some of the world's most hostile terrain, including steep gorges, swift-moving streams, and constantly damp, moss-covered rocks and logs. It also climbed mountains as high as 6,000 feet. The Australian 25th Brigade, as well as Allied air, engineer, and anti-aircraft units, were being added to Port Moresby in the meantime. The two remaining battalions of the 144th Infantry Regiment and a mountain artillery battalion, which had to land forcibly at Basabua, west of Buna, near Gona, due to Allied air interdiction, and then be transported to Buna to support Yokoyama's command at Isarava, were also expected to be added to the Yokoyama Advance Force. To await the result of a second attack, the IJN amphibious assault at Milne Bay, which aimed to capture the recently built Allied airfield there, and provide a base for a subsequent naval attack on Port Moresby. Hyakutake gave Horii the order to move to the southern side of the Owen Stanleys on August 28th. On August 25th, the amphibious landings at Milne Bay began, but they were unsuccessful, and on September 7th, the Japanese withdrew their assault soldiers. Horii was alone without IJN air backup if there wasn't a simultaneous amphibious attack on Port Moresby from Milne Bay. The South Seas detachment of Horii was suffering from severe malnourishment and sickness. General Horii and IJA forces from the 41st and 144th Regiments landed in Kokoda village in poor condition at the beginning of September. Japanese soldiers and Korean and Formosan laborers had to transport supplies to the front and the injured back to Kokoda village. Horii struggled with logistics, and his plan to attack Port Moresby via crossing the Owen Stanleys was delayed. The Australians had just withdrew to Imita Ridge across the valley to the south, and the Japanese genuinely cried with pleasure when they were able to glimpse the plains and sea surrounding Port Moresby as they labored up Ioribaiwa Ridge on September 16, 1942. The searchlights of the Allied airport on the outskirts of Port Moresby, which was 27 air miles away, were visible to the Japanese at night from Ioribaiwa Ridge. The Japanese would never get this close to Port Moresby. The majority of the troops had been dead, maimed, and disabled by diseases like beriberi, dengue fever, malaria, and dysentery as a result of the onslaught, and the Japanese supply chain was overburdened. The Japanese advance south from Buna over the Owen Stanley Range had been stopped by the Australians and the harshness of Papua. After only 4 weeks of arduous travel and jungle fighting, only 1,500 of the 6,000 troops who had left Buna in mid-August were still fit enough to fight. Horii was forced to halt his drive on Port Moresby at Ioribaiwa Ridge and prepare defensive works while awaiting reinforcements due to stiffened Australian resistance at Imita Ridge by 2 Australian militia battalions, which was later reinforced with more battle-hardened Middle East veteran formations of the AIF's 28th Brigade. Additionally, a near-constant Allied air presence attacked Japanese supply lines running back to Buna. On September 24th, however, Horii was given the order by the Japanese High Command to retreat via the Kokoda Trail and take up defensive positions at Buna and Gona. On September 28th, the Japanese, who had set up cannons and excavated trenches and weapon pits around the Ioribaiwa Ridge in the final week of September, retreated from their positions as Australian forces attacked. Due to the growing demand for additional troops in Guadalcanal, the Japanese made this strategic withdrawal. MacArthur wanted a corps commander for a young American corps, consisting of the 32nd and 51st Infantry Divisions, training in Australia. By chance, Marshall sent him Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger, a 1909 graduate of West Point. Majors Gensders oversaw the 32nd and 41st Divisions. They also sent Horace Fuller and Edwin Harding, respectively. In order to relieve the strain on the Australians retreating down the Kokoda Trail to the Imita Ridge before the Japanese High Command stopped Horii's advance on the Ioribaiwa Ridge, MacArthur gave Eichelberger's I Corps headquarters the order on September 10th to send Harding's 32nd Division to New Guinea. MacArthur sent the 126th and 128th Regiments of the comparatively inexperienced 32nd Division to Port Moresby, without any significant jungle combat training. Additionally, the 32nd Division did not receive the training that other Army Ground Forces divisions were receiving domestically because it was a National Guard formation that was sent to Australia early. By September 28th, the day General Horii's forces left their positions on Ioribaiwa Ridge, the 2 regiments had arrived in Port Moresby. However, Harding's 4 battalions of division artillery, 48 field guns, including the superb bunker-busting 105mm howitzers, were abandoned in Australia due to shipping and air transit shortcomings. The mission assigned to these two regiments was to seize the large collection of Japanese entrenched sites at Buna. However, Eichelberger had doubts about the 32nd's battle prowess. Troops of the 32nd Division sailed from Port Moresby in a variety of wooden schooners and coastal craft due to the vast coastline of northern Papua near Buna. These insufficient ships were unable to transport heavy machinery, tanks, or artillery, and were open to Japanese airstrikes. Not surprisingly, the U.S. When an enemy controlled the airfields, Navy leaders did not want to risk their heavier boats in unexplored waters. In the waters off Guadalcanal, the Allied fleets were also engaged in combat with Japanese surface ships. After committing to the defensive at Buna, the SNLF troops and Japanese infantrymen looked for places to hide, such as trenches, rifle pits, pillboxes, coconut treetops, camouflaged entrenchments, and even entangled tree roots. The American and Australian assault soldiers would never see the defenders and would be under withering fire if the Japanese were effective in their camouflage techniques. The thick of the jungle canopy hampered airstrikes, so the Allied attackers had to learn, frequently on the fly, how to locate and explore possible hidden defense positions. The Allies would use tanks, artillery, flamethrowers, and bazookas to destroy them once they were located. Smaller infantry troops advanced with covering fire from a collaborating machine gun or rifle unit, replacing direct, large-scale infantry assaults. Units would continue to advance against enemy positions in this fashion, switching between covering fire and advance. The defenses along the 11-mile front of the northern Papuan coastline, which stretched from Gona in the west to Cape Ndiadere to the east of Buna Mission and Europa Point, were expertly planned by the Japanese engineers, according to an Australian after-action report. Hundreds of bunkers made of coconut logs were built. Some had iron plates for reinforcement, while others had iron rails and sand-filled oil drums. Bunkers were constructed above ground and then covered with dirt, tree fronds, and other vegetation to make them virtually invisible in places that were too damp for trenches and dugouts. Any advancing Allied soldiers were met with a fierce interlocking field of fire from the bunkers, which could hold 3 to 5 machine guns. Infantry and open rifle pits to the front, sides, and back of the constructed entrenchments guarded the bunkers. While some men would wait in the carefully camouflaged forest, others would hide in foxholes, beneath trees, or even in hollowed-out logs. Among the American and Australian zones along the Buna front, snipers among the towering coconut trees or in positions in the cover of the terrain posed a serious threat. Across the road from Soputa, which is slightly over 7 miles inland, to Sanananda Point on the sea, another Japanese defensive line was constructed in order to thwart the advance of the 7th Australian Division. The Australians to the west of the Girua River, who trudged over forest routes to attack Gona and Sanananda Point, formed an inter-allied border. Before it vanishes in the swamp southeast of Buna village, the Girua River is roughly 50 feet wide. Between Buna and Sanananda Point, the river eventually empties into many mouths that go to the ocean. There were 2 more canals that were crucial to the battle. The first was Entrance Creek, which led from Buna village to Buna Mission and opened into a tiny lagoon. Between Europa and Strip Points, Saimemi Creek travels north to the region between Buna's old and new strips. From there, it parallels the old strip's northern edge to the sea. The main marsh on the Buna front is located between Entrance Creek to the west and Simemi Creek to the east. It extends interior to the area around the villages of Saimemi and Ango, which were at the heart of the 32nd Division's area of operations against Buna. With trees up to 100 feet tall and closely spaced, this marsh is completely impenetrable. The floor of the swamp, which is made up of underbrush and tangled roots, is constantly wet. There were 2 sizable coconut plantations. The first, Government Plantation, was located between Buna Mission and the mouth of Saimemi Creek and was roughly 300 yards wide. Much larger, Europa Plantation stretched southward from Cape Ndiadere in the east to Strip Point in the west. The old strip, a target of the Allied assault, was located on a sizable kunai grass-covered tract southwest of Doropa Plantation. If the airfield was in Allied control, the Japanese would not have another opportunity to take Port Moresby by land and use it as a base for the 5th U.S. Air Force. The New Strip, a dummy field constructed by the Japanese, was located in a grassy area east of Sememi Creek and ran east-west. Following the Australians' peaceful reoccupation of Kokoda Village on November 2nd, MacArthur had to defend his recently gained airfields at Kokoda and Dobadura, which is located roughly 3 miles south of Engo, while the Kokoda Trail crisis subsided. Instead of using the less expensive tactic of starving the Japanese into surrender, MacArthur was determined to launch a campaign of annihilation against them on the northern coast of Papua, because Japanese control of Buna may eventually endanger both airfields. The Dobadura airfield, which is located 10 miles south of Buna, was to be destroyed, and Buna was to be held at all costs, according to the Japanese. Dobadura's destruction would make it more difficult for the Allies to retake Papua and reduce their ability to launch airstrikes. Losing Buna would put the Japanese position on Rabaul and future operations on New Guinea in jeopardy, Tokyo reasoned. The Japanese were so determined to fight to the death to protect the Buna front. According to MacArthur's plan, the Australian 7th Division would launch a general advance on November 16, 1942, forcing the Japanese to retreat along the Kokoda Trail. Meanwhile, the U.S. 32nd Division would launch a covert, wide, encompassing eastward march before launching a westward attack against the Buna front along Papua's northern coast. The Girua River was to be the boundary between the American and Australian forces. Nonetheless, the Japanese soldiers stationed there were well shielded from any inland assault. A Japanese machine gun in a fortified pillbox could hold off a battalion as swamps and deep vegetation directed the Allied attackers down a few trails. With the Americans moving up the coast of northern New Guinea, the Australians would spend a lot of blood trying to take Buna away from the Japanese. While the 127th Regiment stayed in Port Moresby, the 32nd's 126th and 128th Regiments proceeded to advance into position over the end of October and the first part of November 1942. As the left flank of the Army, the 2nd Battalion, the 126th Regiment, marched overland to Buna via the Kokoda Trail, a rough path that climbed over 8,000 feet across the Owen Stanley Range. This unit suffered casualties from sickness and non-combat causes. On November 20th, the unit arrived in Soputa after 5 exhausting weeks. Experiencing what the weary Americans called in-green hell, the 3 battalions of the 128th Regiment were airlifted by MAJ, General George C. Kenney's 5th Air Force transport planes, to an upgraded airstrip at Wainegala Mission on Collingwood Bay, about 65 miles from Buna, to save time and effort and prevent a tiring march through the Papuan jungle. The 128th was then transported by motor barges to Pongani, which is just over 20 miles from Buna along the Papuan coast. The other 2 battalions of the 126th Regiment were airlifted to this new location on November 9th, 11 after the forces there built a landing field. In total, C-47s transported about 15,000 infantrymen and auxiliary soldiers to the Buna region. Kenney transformed the 5th Air Force into a multifaceted force that provided aircraft artillery to troops without field artillery, as well as troop transport and logistics. The daylight interdiction of Japanese coastal trade and supplies to their garrisons in New Guinea was increased thanks to improvements refined by his B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc medium bombers. These were revolutionary tactics in 1942, and in order to provide Kenney's planes with a base closer to the combat zone to carry out their various missions, Papuan laborers and Army engineers started constructing airfields in northern Papua, particularly at Dobadura, which is located south of Buna and east of the unaffordable Girua River. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi assumed command of the newly established IJA 18th Army in mid-November 1942, with headquarters located in Rabaul and operations in New Guinea. The commander of the 8th Area Army, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, was to oversee Adachi's operations. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo gave Imamura direct orders to retake Guadalcanal first, then hold and solidify at Buna. In the future, Port Moresby would be the target of another land invasion. Adachi's 18th Army and Hyakutake's 17th Army, which was dedicated only to the Guadalcanal operation, made up Imamura's area army. Adachi gathered 2,000 to 2,500 troops for the defense of the Buna area, including roughly 1,800 who had not taken part in the overland attack on Port Moresby. Despite the intense Allied bomber interdiction of Japanese reinforcements and mountain guns from Rabaul, IAGUA formations, SNLF units, engineers, gunners, and service personnel made up Buna's Japanese defenders. While some had just landed, roughly 100 infantrymen from the 144th Regiment had made it through the retreat up the Kokoda Trail, where General Horii was killed when he drowned in the swift-moving Kumusi River while attempting to reach Lae. By November 18th, the 126th 1st Battalion was using the same crude trail going up from Oro Bay, while the American 128th Regiment's 1st Battalion was on the northern coast road between Hariko and the Doropa Plantation. This regiment's remaining members were positioned close to Inanda. While parts of the 128th 2nd Battalion helped with the construction of an airstrip at Dobodura, the 3rd Battalion, 128th Regiment, was located close to Simimi. The Japanese air interdiction, like that of the Allies, had choked off coastal supplies by motor barges and schooners, so food and ammunition would need to be flown to this new sector. At Ango, the rest of the 2nd Battalion became a division reserve. Buna would have to be reached via 4 jungle pathways, each about 12 feet wide, but always vulnerable to being washed out by tropical downpours, as it lacked a harbor and was sheltered by marshes and creeks on the inland side. In order for jeeps to transport supplies and evacuate casualties, the American engineers of the 114th Regiment were continuously building down corduroy roads with coconut log surfaces. There were only 2 ways for Americans to reach Buna, one along the Ango Trail toward Buna Mission and Buna Village on the west side of the marsh, and the other between Simemi Creek and the east coast. It took 2 days to march from one flank to the other due to the 2 routes' lack of lateral connectivity. Furthermore, the Americans lacked intelligence regarding the enemy's resistance and the positions of defensive constructions they would shortly encounter. Adachi's Buna front was less than a mile from the ocean and slightly over 3 miles long, stretching from the Jirua River at Buna Village in the west to Cape Ndiadere in the east. From Buna Mission to the bridge at Simemi Creek, the Japanese possessed a motor road that allowed for reinforcement and lateral communication. In particular, the line of Japanese pillboxes and rifle pits moved eastward across a grassy area called Government Gardens, then ran toward the coast through Government Plantation, ending at Jiropa Point. The entrenched defensive works at Buna Mission ran slightly southwest to Entrance Creek, then turned north to enclose an area known as the Triangle. China and Malaya veterans, Captain Yoshitatsu Yasuda and his Yokosuka, 5th SNLF and the 5th Sasebo SNLF, were responsible for the defense of Buna Village and Buna Mission, the western sector. To prevent an attack from the south, Yasuda had erected substantial barbed wire entanglements throughout this stretch. The SNLF units were set up in the coconut grove and gardens behind, as well as in a honeycomb of bunkers on the main approach between the wetlands. At Buna, other combat personnel survived the 3 months that Tsukioka units spent on Goodenough Island, when Allied air patrols and parts of Horii's retreating South Seas force intercepted their landing barges for the Milne Bay amphibious attack. More entrenched positions were located along the western end of the old strip, which had been constructed by Australian soldiers before the Japanese invasion in July 1942, around 500 yards southeast of Jiropa Point. Several crippled Zero fighters and transports were left stranded on the runway after it was brutally blasted and rendered inoperable after being utilized by Japanese naval planes in August. Between the old and new airstrips, enemy positions moved eastward. They crossed the Simemi Creek and entered a wooden causeway that was almost 40 yards long. They then avoided the northern boundary of the new strip by passing through the Doropa Plantation and abutting the ocean half a mile south of Cape Ndiadere. Colonel Shigemi Yamamoto's 3rd Battalion, 229th Infantry Regiment, which had taken Canton and Hong Kong and had been at Gona until mid-November, guarded this eastern Japanese flank. The 73rd Independent Unit's heavy anti-aircraft battery, the 3rd Battalion's mountain artillery battery, the 55th Field Artillery Unit, and 700 replacements for the 144th Infantry Regiment were among the many groups. The American forces would encounter primarily new, fit, and well-equipped Japanese soldiers during the first 2 weeks of the Allied advance on Buna. Prior to launching expensive frontal or flank attacks, the latter requiring crawling through marshy terrain, advancing American forces had to learn how to find the enemy bunkers, which were camouflaged. Forward units were frequently destroyed by Japanese machine gun fire. Because flashless gunpowder was employed by Arisaka rifles and Japanese machine guns, it was impossible to determine the source of the shooting. The well-hidden Japanese positions were occasionally breached by approaching American infantrymen before the defenders opened fire on the patrol's rear echelon from all angles, severely wounding them. The 128th Regiment's 1st and 3rd Battalions began the Buna operation on November 19, 1942, when they marched toward the Japanese positions along the new strip from Saimemi Creek to the seashore. Unseen Japanese machine gun and rifle fire met the 1st Battalion on the beach trail, heading toward the Doropa Plantation, and the 3rd Battalion southwest of the dummy airport at New Strip. With lateral lines of communication, the Japanese rapidly strengthened their positions, halting the 128th Regiment's 2-battalion march. A displeased MacArthur gave General Harding the order to storm Buna's defensive defenses 2 days later, saying, "All columns will be driven through to objectives regardless of losses. At all costs, take Buna today." MacArthur. That day, with no American artillery in the area, Harding ordered a frontal assault along the Japanese easternmost lines, following a preliminary bombing raid and mortar bombardment. Once more, the American onslaught was halted by snipers and well-directed Japanese mortar and machine gun fire. Furthermore, in order to be prepared at their machine guns when the Americans advanced, the Japanese would sneak return to their pillboxes after the air raids and flee to reinforced bunkers during aerial bombardment. Additionally, on November 21st, the enemy halted the 2nd Battalion, 128th Regiment at the Triangle, south of Government Gardens in the western sector, after they had completed the exhausting Kappa Kappa Trail march. The terrain was primarily knee-deep swamp water, which confused the GIs, especially in the dark, damaged radios, saturated mortar ammunition, and clogged machine guns and rifles with muck. Only at locations well guarded by Japanese machine guns and barbed wire that kept the Americans at bay was Entrance Creek, west of the Triangle, unaffordable for a flanking move. In order to assist the 2nd Battalion, 128th Regiment, which was having difficulties in the Triangle and at Entrance Creek, the Australians released the 2nd Battalion, 126th Regiment, which had been assisting the Australian 7th Division, on November 22nd. From his remaining 3,500 combat soldiers, General Harding organized 2 sizable task forces. The 2nd Battalions of the 126th and 128th Regiments were assigned to the Urbana force, which would operate west of the sizable marsh. Under Colonel John Mott's leadership, the smaller of the 2 armies was assigned to attack Buna village before moving on to Buna mission. The bigger force, known as Warren Force, was commanded by Brig General Hanford McNider and consisted of the 1st Battalion, 126th Regiment, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 128th Infantry Regiment, and some Australian units east of the swamp. Warren Force was directed to assault the defenses of the eastern sector between Gyropa Point and Cape Endediaire. Before reinforcements arrived on the Buna front, this was the final Allied troop movement. After crawling through the foul swamp for a day, Urbana force advanced on the Triangle region on November 24th and eventually arrived at a location beyond Entrance Creek, which is next to the Northwest Trail leading to Buna village. Both swamp and open kunai grass areas hindered advances, making it impossible to reach the Triangle from the east, a deep enemy salient of interlocking machine guns and mortars. Therefore, any more Urbana force movement would need to be toward Buna village, northwest of the Triangle. The battle moved to the Warren Force region on November 26th. Following aerial and artillery bombardment, elements of the 1st Battalion, 126th Regiment, and 3rd Battalion, 128th Regiment, attacked Japanese positions at Doropa Plantation. The latter was supported by 1 American 105mm howitzer battery, 6 Australian 25-pounders, and a mountain howitzer that had recently been airlifted to the front. However, Allied fighters had trouble identifying targets and resupplying ammo. The infantry attack faltered under intense enemy machine gun fire because the Japanese reinforced bunkers had not been demolished by the initial aircraft and cannon bombardment. For 72 hours, no additional attempts were made to weaken the defensive positions. The strafing by Japanese fighters from Lae significantly impeded the war-enforced progress. On November 30th, a 2-battalion assault without the intended Australian Bren gun carriers failed in the Doropa Plantation to the east, while a fresh onslaught on the Urbana force front west of Entrance Creek failed. Thus, after causing roughly 500 American casualties, the Japanese defensive line along the Buna front was undeniable and just as powerful as it had been over 2 weeks previously. The 32nd battalions were reduced to half-size due to battle and non-combat casualties from diseases like scrub typhus, diarrhea, and malaria. After visiting Harding and suggesting a change in leadership, MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard K. Sutherland, gave Eichelberger the order to leave for Buna on December 1st, assume command of the Allied forces east of the Girua River, and remove all officers who won't fight, relieve regimental and battalion commanders, put corporals in charge of companies, and sergeants in charge of battalions. If you don't return alive, I want you to take Buna. Even though the Japanese had maintained their positions, their morale was dropping and attrition was rising. According to writings from December 1st in enemy diaries discovered at Buna, they had been waiting for reinforcements for the last 4 days. My body will be buried in New Guinea and become fertilizer for the land of Buna, and now we are waiting solely for death. As Kenny's B-17s sent 105mm howitzers to the Buna front, Allied logistical challenges were being surmounted. On December 5th and 18th, respectively, Australian crewed Bren carriers and M3 Stuart light tanks arrived at Eichelberger and went into service. Supplies began to arrive in greater quantities via air and sea. Eichelberger appointed new local commanders and made some minor reorganizations to his forces. Harding was succeeded by Major General Albert Waldron, the artillery chief for the 32nd Division. Warren Force was commanded by Brig. General Clarence Martin and Colonel John Gross was to head Urbana Force. The 32nd and Eichelberger's Biencourt headquarters were merged to form Buna Force Headquarters, which is located at Saimemi Village. Enlisted men and junior commanders were gaining battle experience and learning some jungle craft. On December 5th, 1942, a 3-battalion assault with auxiliary Bren gun carriers started through the Doropa Plantation. However, Japanese snipers in trees, infantry with explosives, and tree stumps swiftly neutralized all of these. Other businesses targeted the bridge that spans Simemi Creek and the western boundary of the new strip. Gains were assessed in yards since the Japanese positions could not be lowered. From December 6 to 14, Warren Force would repeatedly attack the enemy, but it was unable to breach the Japanese line in spite of MacArthur's requests. Company G, 126th Regiment, platoon-sized components, successfully drove east of the Girua River to the sea on December 5th on the Urbana Force front, separating Buna Village from Japanese reinforcements at Buna Mission and Government Station. To assist in fending off Japanese counterattacks along the shore, the 126th E Company hurried in. Despite several fatalities, including the wounding of an Eichelberger aide and Waldron, the new commander of the 32nd, the German defensive line in the western sector had finally been breached. Eichelberger sent in reinforcements in the form of the 3rd Battalion, 127th Regiment, under Lieutenant Coldress Edwin Swedberg, who were air transported to the Dobadura and Papandetta Arields on December 9th to keep the breakthrough near Buna Village from stalling. On December 11th, they relieved the 2nd Battalion, 126th Regiment. Following a massive mortar barrage, 2 companies from 3rd Battalion, 127th Regiment took Buna village 3 days later after patrolling and getting to know the opposing fortifications. Since there was no warning to allow them to temporarily move to reinforced shelters, some of the few Japanese captives captured said that American mortar bombardment was particularly successful in wearing them down in their rifle pits and pillboxes. Eichelberger made the decision to wait until mid-December for light tanks and new Australian troops requested by General Blamey to be moved up from Milne Bay in order to break the impasse around Buna on the Warren Front. Along with 7 light M3 tanks from X Squadron, Australian 2-6 Armoured Regiment, Brigadier George F. Wooten's remaining 18th Infantry Brigade battalions arrived, with only the Australian short 25-pounder and a few American 105mm howitzers with little ammo. The Allied firepower at Buna would be significantly increased. The 3 American battalions on the Warren Front advanced against the Japanese throughout the whole line between December 15th and 18. A fresh line of enemy bunkers stopped parts of the Australian 2-9 Infantry Battalion as they swung west down the north coast on December 18th, after they had crossed the American lines with the accompanying tanks and arrived at Cape Endayadere. After the 3rd Battalion, 128th Regiment, followed up on the Australian advance, an Allied beach position was built immediately south of Cape Endayadere. However, a Japanese anti-aircraft gun destroyed 2 M3 tanks and put a 3rd tank on fire. Furthermore, the Japanese were forced to evacuate to ready-made bunkers close to the Simami Creek Bridge when both American and Australian forces, notably 1st Battalion, 128th Regiment, were able to drive them out of their defenses at the eastern spur of the new strip. Although the reinforced Japanese bunkers at the Doropa Plantation and along the northern side of the new strip had been reduced, about 1/3 of the Australians were killed. The remainder of the Doropa Plantation was traversed by the Australian 2 Sign Battalion and parts of the 3rd Battalion, 128th Regiment, on a 1,000-yard front on December 19, 20. In order to reach the bridge, the 1st Battalions of the 126th and 128th Regiments destroyed every Japanese bunker on the east side of Simami Creek. Nevertheless, the enemy had blown a 12-foot hole in this causeway, which would need to be repaired or a flanking movement was necessary. On December 21-23, the Australian 2-10 Battalion crossed the stream north of the bridge, posing a danger to the Japanese forces there after making an unsuccessful attempt to close the gap. By lunchtime on December 23rd, the 1st Battalion, 126th Regiment, had crossed the bridge and arrived at the southern end of the old strip. Now, the American and Australian battalions would try to advance parallel to each other, along the old strip's southern and northern flanks. Despite fierce fire from enemy bunkers on the northern and center parts of the old strip, Allied forces made a laborious 500-yard advance. On December 23rd, after nightfall, the 114th Engineers fixed the bridge's opening, allowing Australian M3 light tanks to cross Simami Creek. To reach the northeast side of the old strip, an Allied tank attack was launched across the bridge on December 24th. However, the Japanese or the shell-pocked terrain damaged all of the tanks. On December 16th, the Americans had taken control of an area known as Coconut Grove, but they had not yet taken control of the triangle. After crossing Entrance Creek North above Coconut Grove on a U.S.-built footbridge, the 127th Regiment was able to establish a bridgehead on the east bank of the creek on December 24th. Engineers in the Army. Instead of attacking the enemy directly, the triangle area's resistance would now be merely contained. In order to get between Buna Mission and Doropa Point, which would be reached on December 29th, the American troops began a drive toward the northern shore on Christmas Eve. The American and Australian battalions were unable to advance due to a strong pocket of Japanese bunkers. Therefore, the Allied attacks on Christmas Day were not very successful. With the help of an Australian 25-pounder artillery piece near the Simami Creek Bridge, which fired armor-piercing shells at the stubborn Japanese bunkers halting the advance along the old strip, units of the 1st Battalion, 126th Regiment, were able to make a gradual breakthrough on December 26-27. In order to facilitate a northward push to Government Plantation, which physically started in the east at the mouth of the Saimeme Creek and continued to Buna Mission to the northwest. The western end of the old strip was reached by dark on December 27th. American patrols discovered that the Japanese had left the Triangle area early on December 28th. In the Triangle, the Americans also learned the cause of the strong enemy resistance. It had more than 18 reinforced bunkers that supported one another and were connected by trenches for communication. The following day, the Allied soldiers halted to await reinforcements as 4 new M3 light tanks led a sluggish assault on government plantation. On December 31st, additional tanks were brought in by the 2 to 12 of the 18th Infantry Brigade, an Australian relief battalion. On New Year's Day 1943, an offensive headed by Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold, commander of 212 Battalion, pushed through to the northern coast at Garopa Point, while other units of the 212 Battalion proceeded west to make contact with Urbana force. Elements of this force headed southeast toward the major enemy defenses at Government Plantation. To help destroy the remaining Japanese pockets of resistance, the 3rd Battalion, 128th Regiment advanced northwest between the coast and the Old Strip on January 2nd. According to reports, Colonel Yamamoto and Captain Yasuda died facing the Australian tanks approaching their command bunker. Due in major part to the lack of Australian tank backup, tank support that the Warren Force had benefited from, progress on the Urbana front has been sluggish since the 3rd Battalion, 127th Regiment captured Buna village 2 weeks prior. On January 2, 1943, the Japanese base at Buna was under Allied control following 3 months of frontal attacks, as the Papuan terrain precluded envelopments with sizable forces. Of the initial 2,000 Japanese defenders, 1,450 were known to have been captured or killed at Buna alone, and many more perished in the bush or at sea. 353 Americans and 267 Australians were among the 620 troops killed by the Urbana and Warren forces on the Allied side at Buna. In addition, 132 people went missing and 2,065 were injured. Due in great part to the lack of quinine, malaria caused tens of thousands of medical deaths. In terms of unit integrity, the 32nd Infantry Division suffered a serious mauling at Buna and would have a year-long refit in Australia in order to get ready for the upcoming conflicts. In order to retrain and equip the 2 American divisions for upcoming operations in New Guinea, Eiselberger went back to Australia in his capacity as commander of Ok Corps. Although it came at a terrible cost, the Papuan War of 1942-1943 taught the U.S. Army's leaders in the Southwest Pacific a lot. It was evident that the U.S. more training was needed for Army units. The Australians, on the other hand, had served in the Middle East. Following the January 1943 triumph in Papua, MacArthur said that there would be no more Bunas, the primeval swamps, the dank and silent bush, the heavy loss of life, the fixity of purpose of the Japanese, for most of whom death could be the only ending, all combined to make the struggle so appalling that most of the hardened soldiers who were to emerge from it would uneasily remember it as their most exacting experience of the whole war. A ghastly nightmare, states the official Australian history.